The rain came without warning, the way most things did in the territory of New Mexico in the spring of 1878, and Milton Sawyer had already made up his mind before the first drop ever hit the brim of his hat. He had been carrying the ring for 11 days. 11 days of riding the fence lines of the Grayson homestead, 11 days of checking on the cattle and counting the heads and pretending that was the only reason he kept finding himself on that particular stretch of land, 11 days of looking for the perfect moment and convincing himself it had not yet arrived. The weather had been too hot, then too dry, then too windy. He had told himself he was waiting for a good day, a clear sky, maybe a Sunday afternoon when the light came golden over the mesa, and everything looked like it belonged in one of those paintings he had seen once in a shop window in Santa Fe. He had told himself he needed the right moment. What he had not told himself, what he had been careful not to examine too closely, was that he was afraid. Milton Sawyer was 26 years old and had spent the better part of a decade working cattle drives from Texas up through the territories, had slept under stars in 40-below winds, had once stood his ground against a man twice his size over a water dispute that nearly turned ugly, and had never once in all of that time thought of himself as a coward. But standing on the porch of the Grayson house with a ring burning a hole in his vest pocket and Letitia Grayson somewhere inside doing whatever she did on a Thursday afternoon, he felt something very close to terror. He pressed his horse, a pale buckskin he called Hector, into an easy walk along the creek bed that ran south of the property and told himself he was just taking stock of the land. It was good land. He had thought so the first time he ever laid eyes on it, 2 years ago when he had ridden through Cimarron on his way to a job that had since come and gone, and left him with nothing but a little money and a lot of restlessness. The Grayson homestead sat on a gentle rise above the Cimarron River, not the grandest spread in Colfax County but solid and well kept, with a proper house of adobe and timber, and a barn that had been built to last. Letitia's father, Edmund Grayson, had filed on the land in 1871 under the Homestead Act, and had worked it with a stubbornness that the land itself seemed to respect. Edmund had died 14 months ago, a fever that came on fast and did not leave. He had been 53 years old and had left behind 2 daughters, a piece of land with a mortgage that was not quite paid, and a reputation for being the most honest man in 3 counties. People still talked about him in the way that meant it. After his death, Letitia had stayed. Her younger sister, Frances, had gone to live with their aunt in Taos because she was 17, and the homestead was too much for 2 women alone, or so the aunt had decided. Frances had not wanted to go. Letitia had cried the night she watched her sister leave, and then the next morning she had gone out to feed the chickens and check on the 2 horses and done everything she was supposed to do, because that was simply who she was. She was 24 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's strong chin, and a laugh that arrived quickly and honestly whenever something actually struck her as funny. She was not easily fooled and not easily flattered, which was something Milton had discovered early and come to admire deeply. She had a way of looking at a person that suggested she was seeing considerably more than they were saying, and she had a directness about her that some people in the county found unsettling, and that Milton found absolutely irresistible. He had come to work the Grayson land after Edmund died, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had been in Cimarron when it happened, and he had known the family, and it had seemed like the right thing to do. He had a reputation for being good with cattle and better with fence repairs, and Letitia had accepted his offer of help with a practicality that he appreciated. She had told him what the pay would be, which was modest, and what the work would be, which was considerable, and she had looked him in the eye the whole time she was saying it, and he had said yes before she finished the sentence. That had been 14 months ago, and in those 14 months something had shifted so gradually, and so completely that Milton could not have said exactly when it happened. He had gone from being a hired hand who respected the situation he found himself in to being a man who woke up every morning thinking about whether Letitia had slept well, who noticed when she was tired before she said anything about it, who felt the whole day organize itself differently on the mornings when she smiled at him over the breakfast table versus the mornings when she was quiet and distant. He had been slow to admit it even to himself. He was not a man given to romanticism. He had grown up in West Texas in a house where his father worked from sunup to sundown, and his mother did the same, and love was expressed in the way the coffee was always hot and the mended boots were always waiting by the door. He understood love as something demonstrated in practical ways, and so it had taken him some time to recognize that what he felt for Letitia Grayson was something he had never felt for anyone else, something that lived in his chest like a warm coal, something that made the world feel more vivid and more worth caring about. He had bought the ring in Santa Fe 4 months ago, on a supply run that he had extended by a day for exactly this purpose. He had stood in the jeweler's shop for a long time, longer than he was comfortable admitting, looking at the modest selection available. He had chosen a ring with a small garnet, dark red as the hills at sunset, set in plain silver. It had seemed like the right choice for a woman like Letitia, who did not care for excess but who appreciated things made with care. And then he had carried it for 4 months, waiting for the right moment. He turned Hector toward the eastern fence line and let the horse set his own pace, which was unhurried. The sky to the west had been doing something interesting for the past hour, piling up clouds in a way that Milton recognized as meaningful. He had spent too many years watching whether to misread those clouds. They were heavy and gray-bellied and moving faster than the air at ground level suggested they should be moving. There would be rain before supper time. Maybe before then. He should head back to the barn, he thought. He should get Hector settled and check that the barn doors were properly latched and make sure the tools left out by the water trough were brought inside. These were the sensible things to do. Instead, he found himself riding toward the house. Letitia was in the kitchen garden when he came around the side of the house, crouching between rows of early beans with a small hand tool, working at the soil with the focused attention she gave to everything she did. She had her dark hair pulled back and covered with a simple cloth, and she was wearing a work dress the color of dried sage that she had mended twice at the hem. She looked up when she heard Hector's hooves on the dry ground, and she straightened, and she shielded her eyes against the pale afternoon light and looked at him. "You are back early," she said. It was neither a question nor an accusation. It was just an observation, delivered in her usual direct way. "The weather is turning," Milton said, swinging down from the saddle. He looped Hector's reins around the post at the garden gate and stood there for a moment, not quite knowing how to proceed. The ring was in his pocket. His heart was doing something irregular that he found deeply inconvenient. Letitia looked at the sky. She had the same instinct for weather that he did, which he supposed came from the same source, which was paying attention to the land you lived on. "Yes," she said. "I thought so this morning. Those clouds coming over the Sangers. I should get Hector put up," Milton said. "You should," she agreed, but she was still looking at him with that expression she sometimes wore, the one that suggested she was waiting for him to say whatever it was he had actually come to say. He took Hector to the barn and settled him in his stall and made sure the hay was right and the water was fresh, and all the while his mind was running over what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and whether this was the right time. The sky outside the barn window was going darker by the minute. The smell of rain was sharp and close. He could hear the first distant roll of thunder somewhere over the mountains to the west. When he came back out of the barn, Letitia had gone inside. He could see the lamp light coming golden through the kitchen window, and the thin curl of smoke from the chimney where she had built up the cook fire. The air had gone cool and electric, the way it did just before a serious rain, and the first fat drops were beginning to hit the dust around his boots in soft, dark circles. He stood there in the yard with the rain beginning to fall, and the light coming from the kitchen window and the ring in his pocket, and he thought about all the reasons he had been waiting, and every single one of them suddenly seemed very thin. He walked to the kitchen door and knocked twice, which was the particular rhythm he always used so she would know who it was, and she called for him to come in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread from earlier in the day and the coffee that was always on the stove. Letitia was standing at the window, watching the rain come down, her arms folded across her chest. She turned when he came in, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway and looked at her. "Shut the door," she said, "or we will have a muddy floor." He shut the door. He took off his hat. He turned the hat in his hands and looked at her and said, "Letitia, I need to say something to you." She was quiet for a moment, watching him. Whatever was on her face, it was careful. She was not a woman who showed everything she was thinking, but right now there was something in her eyes that he could not quite read. "I have been trying to find the right moment," he said. "I have been waiting for a good day, a proper day, a day that seemed like it deserved what I was planning to say. And then it occurred to me, about 10 minutes ago, that I have been carrying this for 4 months and no day has been right enough, and I think maybe I have been using that as a reason not to do the thing I have been wanting to do." He reached into his vest pocket and took out the ring. It was wrapped in a small square of cloth that he had kept it in since the day he bought it, and his fingers were not entirely steady when he unwrapped it and held it out in his palm. Letitia's eyes went to his hand, and then to his face, and then back to his hand. Outside, the rain was coming down hard now, drumming on the roof with the serious intent of a real storm, and the thunder was closer, a low rolling sound that moved through the mountains like something alive. "Milton," she said, and her voice had changed. "I know the weather is bad," he said. "I know this is not the way I imagined doing this. I have imagined it 100 different ways, on a clear morning or a Sunday when there was nothing needing doing, some moment that felt like it deserved it. But I cannot wait for better weather any longer. I have been carrying this ring for 11 days since I decided to ask you, and 4 months since I bought it. And the truth is I have known what I wanted to say to you since about the 3rd month I was working this land, which means I have been carrying it in my heart for a lot longer than I have been carrying it in my pocket." He was not a man who made speeches. His ears were warm with the awareness of how much he was saying and how he must sound saying it. But he kept going because stopping now would not be something he could live with. "I love you," he said, and the words came out simply, without decoration, which was the only way he knew how to say things that mattered. "I love the way you work this land like it belongs to you and you belong to it. I love the way you think before you speak and mean every word when you do. I love that you never make a problem smaller than it is just to feel better about it. I love watching you with the horses, the way they trust you without any reason other than that you are exactly who you are. I have never met anyone like you, and I know I never will again." He went down on one knee on the kitchen floor, on the scrubbed board she kept swept clean, with the rain hammering on the roof and the thunder coming regular now and the lamplight making everything amber and warm. "Letitia Grayson," he said, "will you marry me?" The silence stretched. The rain filled it up. Somewhere outside, lightning touched the mesa to the west, and the brief light of it came through the windows and then was gone. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took his face in both of her hands, which were work-roughened and warm, and she looked at him for a moment from very close, long enough that he had time to be afraid again, and then she said, "Yes." She said it plainly and certainly, the way she said everything, but her eyes were bright and her hands were not entirely steady either, and when he stood up and took her hands and slid the ring onto her finger, the garnet catching the lamplight like a small dark fire, she looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I am sorry about the weather," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrived quick and honest. "I think it is fine," she said. "I think I would not have wanted it any other way." And then she was close against him, and he had his arms around her, and the storm was making a serious effort on the roof above them, and neither of them cared at all. The news traveled through Cimarron the way news always traveled through small towns, which was faster than the mail and with more editorial commentary. By the following Sunday, when Milton and Letitia drove into town together in the wagon for supplies, at least 4 separate people had congratulated them before they even reached the dry goods store, which meant the postmaster had already talked to the feed store owner who had talked to the blacksmith's wife, and so on in the usual way. The dry goods store was run by a man named Beaufort Crane, who was stout and cheerful, and kept the most reliable stock of anything between Cimarron and Springer. He shook Milton's hand across the counter with genuine warmth and told Letitia she had made an excellent choice, which made her give him the look she reserved for people who needed to reconsider what they were saying. "What I mean," Beaufort amended quickly, "is that you have both made an excellent choice, as is clear." "That is what you meant," Letitia agreed, and wrote out the list of what they needed, and that was that. They had agreed on a 6-week engagement, partly because there were practical things to arrange and partly because Letitia wanted Frances to be there. She wrote to her sister in Taos immediately, and Frances wrote back within the week in the excited, cramped handwriting of someone who had so much to say she was trying to say it all at once. She would come. She would find a way to come. Their aunt was not going to be easy about it, but Frances had her own considerable stubbornness, inherited from the same source as Letitia's, and she would manage. In the meantime, there was a great deal of practical work to attend to, which suited both Milton and Letitia. The house was well built, but would benefit from having someone do a thorough job on the roof before summer, and Milton spent 3 days up there in the cool spring mornings, replacing shingles that had loosened over the winter. Letitia watched him from below with the kind of expression that she would not have described out loud, and he would not have known what to do with even if he had, and she thought about her father, who had built this house board by board with his own hands, and felt something complicated and good at the same time. She had not been sure, for a long time, whether she was sure. That was the honest truth of it, and Letitia valued honesty above most things, especially with herself. She had come to rely on Milton in the 14 months he had been working the land, relied on his steadiness and his competence and his particular brand of quiet humor that arrived without warning and was better for that. She had come to look for him in the morning and notice his absence in the afternoon and feel the day settle differently when he was nearby. She had told herself this was simply what it was to work alongside someone you trusted. She had told herself this for a long time, and she had mostly believed it. But the night he proposed, kneeling on her kitchen floor in his rain-damp clothes with the storm coming down around them, and she had looked into his face and seen everything there in plain sight, she had known with a certainty that left no room for further argument that what she felt for him had been love for a considerable while. She simply had not been ready to call it by its name. She was not someone who rushed toward things. She had learned, watching her father work this land through droughts and late frosts and a cattle market that went up and down like a fever, that patience was not the same thing as passivity, that waiting for the right moment was sometimes wisdom and sometimes simply fear wearing a more respectable coat. She had needed time to understand which one it was for her. And when he had said, with that earnest, slightly unguarded look that he never quite managed to hide when he was saying something true, that he could not wait for better weather any longer, she had understood him completely. Not just the words, but what was underneath them. The admission that wanting a perfect moment had been a way of not risking an imperfect one. She understood that. She had done it herself, just in a different way. The 6 weeks moved the way productive weeks do, full enough that they went quickly and substantial enough that they felt meaningful. Milton had been sleeping in the bunkroom of the barn, which was modest but private and dry, and he continued to do so throughout the engagement, which was the correct and proper thing, and which neither of them questioned. The nights were cool and sometimes cold still, which was the high desert in spring, and she would see the lamp light in the barn window from her bedroom and feel something warm and settled in her chest. They talked more during those 6 weeks than they ever had before, or perhaps it was that they talked differently, with a directness they had not quite had permission for before. He told her about growing up in West Texas, about his father who worked a small ranch outside Abilene and his mother who had died when he was 15, and who he still missed in the particular quiet way of someone who had learned to carry grief without making noise about it. He told her about the years on the cattle drives, the kishome and the good night loving, the seasons of dust and rivers, and the particular companionship of men doing hard work alongside each other. He told her about the winter he had spent trapping in Colorado and the winter after that in New Mexico, and how the territory had got under his skin in a way that nothing else had. She told him about her mother, who had died in the crossing when Letitia was 6, before they ever reached New Mexico, and how her father had carried that grief all the way from Missouri and laid it down in this land, and planted something in it anyway. She told him about the years of building the homestead, which she remembered partly, and had been told about in pieces by her father on evenings when he talked more than usual. She told him about learning to read from a woman in Cimarron who ran a kind of informal school for the children of the area, about the books her father ordered from a catalog in Kansas City, and how she had read everything they had twice. She told him that she was sometimes frightened about the mortgage, which was not paid off and which she had been managing carefully, and he listened to this with a seriousness that she respected, and then they talked together about the numbers and what the cattle would bring at market in the fall, and what a reasonable plan looked like. It was not a romantic conversation in any obvious way, but it was, she thought, in the truest way. Frances arrived on the Tuesday before the wedding on the Thursday, coming in on the Barlow and Sanderson stage from Taos with a canvas bag, and a hat that was slightly better than practical and a face that was a younger version of Letitia's, the same dark eyes and strong chin, and the same particular way of assessing a situation. She embraced Letitia for a long time on the porch, and then she looked at Milton with great care, the way younger sisters look at the man their older sister is going to marry, and then she said, "Well, you are taller than I expected." "I cannot help that," Milton said. "No," Frances said. "I suppose you cannot. Show me the ring." Letitia showed her the ring. Frances looked at the garnet for a long time, and then she looked at Milton again and said, "Good choice," in a tone that closed the subject of her assessment, which she had apparently completed to her satisfaction. The wedding was on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of May, 1878, in the small church in Cimarron that served the local community regardless of denomination, because there was only the one church, and it was sensible to share it. The minister was a compact, earnest man named Reverend Aldous Webb, who had been in Cimarron for 3 years, and who performed his duties with a quiet sincerity that people appreciated. The church was not large and it was not grand, but Frances had gathered early spring flowers from the meadow above the river, wild columbine and patches of yellow, and the small white things that had no name in English, but that her father had always called the beginning of season flowers, and she had arranged them in 2 glass jars that flanked the altar, and the effect was exactly right. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks, ivory cotton with small tucks at the bodice, and lace at the cuffs and collar that had been her mother's, preserved in the cedar chest since her mother's death and now brought out into the light for this occasion. The lace was old and slightly yellowed with age and was, Letitia thought when she put the dress on that morning, more beautiful for it. Milton wore the best of his clothes, a dark coat and gray trousers, and a shirt that Letitia had noticed him pressing very carefully the night before, and he had his hat in his hands when she came through the church door and he saw her, and the look on his face was something that Frances, standing to one side, decided she would keep in her memory for a very long time. Beaufort Crane was there, and the blacksmith whose name was Hatch, and his wife whose name was Opal, and the woman who ran the school, Mrs. Eugenia Darby, and a few of the neighboring ranchers and their families who had known Letitia and her father, and who came because, in a small community like this one, the events of individual lives were taken seriously as the fabric of the whole. There was a man named Pico Lujan who had worked for Edmund Grayson for several years in the early days, and who still ran cattle on the land adjacent to the east. And he had brought his wife Rosalinda and their 3 children, and they sat in the second row, and Pico cried when Letitia and Milton said their vows, which everyone pretended not to notice out of respect for a man's dignity. Reverend Webb read from the relevant passages with feeling, and Milton and Letitia said what was required and what was meant. And when it was done, when he said the words that made it official, Milton looked at his wife and his wife looked at him. And around them the small congregation applauded with the genuine warmth of people who were actually glad. The celebration afterward was held on the grass behind the church, because the weather was, for once, cooperating with complete generosity, and Opal Hatch had organized food in the way that Opal Hatch organized everything, which was thoroughly and without leaving room for failure. There was cold roasted beef and cornbread, and a pot of beans that had been cooking since before dawn, and a cake that Mrs. Darby had made, which was lemon-flavored and better than anything Milton could remember eating. He stood with a piece of this cake in his hand and watched his wife dance with her sister, the 2 of them doing something that was roughly related to the fiddle music that Pico Lujan was playing with great enthusiasm and moderate precision. And he thought that if he lived to be 100, he would remember this afternoon in every detail. Letitia caught him watching and raised her eyebrows at him across the grass, and he raised his cake in acknowledgement, and she laughed, and Francis said something to her that he could not hear, and Letitia shook her head and laughed again. Francis pulled him into the dancing eventually, ignoring his protests that he was not a man who danced, and proved that she was correct that everyone could dance if properly directed, and Pico switched to something slower and Milton danced with his wife, while the afternoon sun moved west over the mountains, and the long shadows came out across the grass, and he held her hand and her waist, and they moved together in the easy way of people who have learned to read each other. Happy. He asked her because he needed to say something, and that was the thing he most needed to know. She looked at him, and the answer was in her face before she gave it in words. Yes, she said. Very. The summer that followed was good by the standards of that country. The rains came in their season, not too heavy and not too sparse, and the grass along the river was thick and green through July, which was the key month for the cattle. Milton managed the herd with the competence of someone who had spent his adult life doing exactly this kind of work, and Letitia managed the books and the household and the garden. And they did all of this together in the sense that neither made any significant decision without consulting the other, which was not the universal arrangement in that time and place, but which was theirs. She was direct with him about money and about the land, and about the decisions that needed to be made, and he appreciated this the way a man appreciates being trusted with the full truth. He was direct with her about what he observed on the range and what he thought it meant, and they had conversations over the supper table that stretched late into the evening, working through problems with the methodical care of 2 people who had both learned that not paying attention to small problems made large problems. The mortgage was a constant presence, a number that Letitia kept in her head at all times, the amount remaining against what the land could produce. Edmund had been making regular payments before his death, and she had continued, and they were not in danger, but neither were they comfortable, and the fall cattle sale would determine how the next year shaped up. In August, the cattle market in Santa Fe came in better than expected, and Milton came home from the drive with enough to make a substantial payment and leave a workable cushion. He put the money on the kitchen table, and Letitia looked at the figures and then looked up at him, and he could see the weight of something leave her face, just slightly, like a coat coming off her shoulders. "This is good," she said. "It is better than last year," he said. "The market for beef is improving. They are still building the railroads, and there are more workers to feed." "The railroad," she said thoughtfully. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line had been pushing south and west through the territory for the past few years, and its progress was something that everyone with cattle to sell paid close attention to. If the line came close enough to Cimarron, it would change the economics of cattle driving considerably. "The rumor in Santa Fe is that the line will reach Springer by next year," Milton said, "which puts it within reasonable distance." Letitia did the arithmetic in her head, which she could do faster than most people could do it on paper. "That changes the cost of the drive significantly." "Yes." She looked at the money on the table and at the numbers she had been keeping in the ledger, and then she looked at him with an expression that was the face she wore when she was making a decision. "I want to increase the herd," she said, "next spring. If we can manage it, I think we should buy more breeding stock." He had been thinking the same thing. "I know a rancher outside Rayado who is selling," he said. "He has good stock. Longhorn and a little Durham cross. I have been thinking about talking to him." "Talk to him," she said, and that was how they generally made their decisions together. Francis came to visit again in September, staying for 3 weeks, and brought news from Taos that the aunt was less impossible than she had been, and that she herself was considering whether she might find her way back to this part of the country in some more permanent arrangement. She was 18 now, Francis, the same strong-boned, dark-eyed face as her sister, with a quick intelligence and an independent streak that made the aunt's house a difficult fit for everyone involved. She had not said anything specific, but Letitia could read her sister the way she read weather, and she believed Francis was working herself up to something. She did not push. Pushing Francis had never worked and was not going to start working now. Instead, she put her sister in the spare room and fed her well and let her work in the kitchen garden in the mornings, and watched her breathe differently in this place that had been her father's land and was now, in a complicated but real way, still partly hers by something deeper than legal title. Milton got on with Francis well, which Letitia had expected but was glad to see confirmed. He was not a man who said a great deal unnecessarily, and Francis was sharp enough to appreciate that, and they had a comfortable working relationship built on mutual respect and a shared understanding that whatever they said to each other would be remembered accurately. Francis helped him mend the south fence line one afternoon, while Letitia was making apple preserves from the small tree by the garden, and when they came back to the house in the evening, Francis said, "He works like father worked," which was the highest thing she knew how to say about a person, and Letitia heard it and felt something deep and solid settle inside her. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard in the way that winters in the high desert were hard, which was intensely cold at night and frequently dry and punctuated by storms that came down from the mountains without a great deal of advance notice. Milton made sure the barn was tight before December, and they bought extra wood, and there were 2 weeks in January where the snow was deep enough that the cattle had to be brought close to the barn and fed from stores, which ate into the hay they had put up in the fall. But they were prepared, and the cattle came through in good condition, which was the main thing. It was during one of the long evenings of that winter that Letitia told him, with the directness that he had come to love as fundamental to who she was, that she was expecting a child. She told him on a February evening while they were sitting by the fire after supper, and she said it simply, and with a steadiness in her voice that did not quite conceal that she was watching his face carefully to see what was there. What was there was something that he could not have described adequately in words, which was a kind of vastness, a feeling of the world expanding outward in all directions at once, a brightness that he felt in his chest and behind his eyes. "When?" he managed. "August," she said. "I think August." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hands and held them and did not say anything for a moment because there was too much to say and it needed to sort itself out before he tried. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I have been tired," she admitted, "more than usual, and in the mornings I have not been feeling well, but I feel well now." "You should tell me when you are not feeling well," he said. "You do not have to manage it quietly." She looked at him with the slight tilt of her head that meant she appreciated what he was saying, and was also perfectly aware that managing things quietly was a deeply ingrained habit that was not going to change overnight. "I know," she said. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire, and he waited because she needed to think before she answered, and she answered honestly or not at all. "A little," she said. "Childbirth is not a small thing. I know that. But I am not afraid in a way that takes over. I am more," she paused, searching. "I am more awed by it than frightened of it. Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," he said. He wrote to his father in Texas that week. His father was not an effusive man and wrote back brief letters in a large, plain hand. And the letter that came back was brief and contained sentences like, "That is good news," and "Your mother would have been glad." And those few words from that particular man carried more weight than a longer letter would have carried from someone else. Letitia wrote to Francis, who wrote back with a flood of excitement and questions, and the announcement that she was absolutely coming in August and would allow no argument on the subject, and also that she had found a situation in Cimarron that she wanted to discuss with Letitia in person, which was both intriguing and slightly worrying, the way Francis's announcements usually were. Spring came back in its usual fashion, gradual and then suddenly complete, the land going from brown to green over the course of 3 weeks in a way that never failed to feel like a kind of miracle no matter how many times you had seen it. The cattle that Milton had bought from the rancher outside Rayado the previous fall had wintered well, and the breeding stock was doing what it was supposed to do, and the prospects for the year were good. They bought 12 more head in March, which stretched the budget but was the right investment, and Milton hired a young man from town named Crispin Soto to help with the work through the busiest months. Crispin was 19, the son of a Cimarron family that had been in the territory since before statehood was ever a question, and he was good with horses and quick to learn, and had the particular quality of understanding what needed doing without being told twice, which Milton valued highly. Letitia moved through her pregnancy with the same practical approach she applied to everything, not making a great deal of fuss, but also not ignoring what her body was telling her. She modified the heavier work and accepted help when it was offered, which was harder for her than it sounds. She kept the garden and the books and the household running, and on the evenings when she was tired, she sat on the porch in the late light and looked out over the land that her father had worked and that she was working still, and she thought about continuity, about what it meant to hand things forward. Milton worried about her in the way that men of that time and place were generally not inclined to articulate, but which expressed itself in practical ways, in making sure the heavier water buckets were always handled, in building a better step up to the porch that she could use without straining, in being close enough to hear her if she called without being so close that she felt watched. He was learning still the difference between caring for someone and hovering over them, and Letitia was a patient teacher mostly because she was frank about the distinction. "I am pregnant," she told him once, "not made of glass. There is a difference." "I know that," he said. "Then stop looking at me like I might break when I carry the water pitcher." "I was not looking at you like that." She gave him the look. "I was possibly looking at you a little like that," he admitted. Frances arrived in the last week of July, as she had promised, with her canvas bag and her slightly better than practical hat, and also with news about the situation in Cimarron that she wanted to discuss. The situation turned out to be a position as a schoolteacher's assistant to Mrs. Darby, who had been looking for help managing the growing number of children in the area as the community expanded. Frances had arranged this through letters and had agreed to begin in the fall, and she was looking for a place to board. Letitia looked at her sister, and the obvious solution presented itself without requiring any discussion. "You will stay here," she said. "The board money would help," Frances said. She was 18 and she was not asking for charity, which was the Grayson approach to things. The board money would help, Letitia agreed, and that was settled. Milton built out the spare room properly before the end of summer, putting in a proper window that had been only a shuttered gap before, and he and Crispin built a small shelf for books, because anyone who knew Francis knew that books were a foundational requirement rather than a luxury. The baby came on the 2nd of September in the year 1879, delivered by a woman named Clara Espinoza, who had been attending births in Colfax County for 20 years, and who was unhurried and competent, and exactly the person you wanted in the room. It was a long night, and Milton spent the hours of it on the porch and in the kitchen, and in the barn checking on Hector for no reason other than that he needed something to do with his hands and his feet. And Francis sat with Letitia through the whole of it and held her hand and talked to her when she needed distraction and was quiet when she needed concentration. The baby was a boy. He came into the world at 3 in the morning with a sound that filled the house, a serious, assertive sound that suggested he had opinions about his situation and was not planning to keep them to himself. When Clara brought him out and put him in Milton's arms, wrapped in the old quilt that Letitia's mother had made before any of them were born, Milton stood very still and looked at this small, red, furious, perfect person, and felt something rearrange inside him that he suspected would never go back to the way it had been before. He sat beside Letitia, and she was tired in the deep way of someone who had done something enormous, and she looked at the baby and then at Milton and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at both of them, and then she closed her eyes and breathed slowly. "Edmund," she said, without opening her eyes. It was not a question. "Edmund," Milton agreed. He had not known she was going to say that, and he had not known he was going to agree, but both things were true the instant they were spoken. Edmund Sawyer, after a man who had built this house and worked this land and left it in good hands. The following years at the Grayson homestead, which everyone in Cimarron had started calling the Sawyer place without any particular announcement, were years of steady building. The cattle herd grew to a size that was genuinely viable, and then to a size that was comfortable. And when the railroad reached Springer in 1880 as the rumors had promised, the cost and time of getting cattle to market dropped enough that the economics of the whole operation improved significantly. Milton made the first run to Springer with 60 head in September of that year and came back with enough money to pay off the remaining balance of the mortgage and have something left over. And he put the deed on the kitchen table and looked at Letitia, and she picked it up and read it through in its entirety, as she read everything, and then set it down carefully. "Free and clear," she said. "Free and clear," he confirmed. She sat with this for a moment in the way she sat with important things, giving them the proper weight. Then she looked at him with those dark eyes that still, after 3 years of marriage, made him feel that she was seeing something in him that he was glad to have seen. "Father would have been satisfied," she said. "I think so," Milton said. "He would have liked you," she added, which was something she had not said before in quite that way, and it hit him somewhere important. Crispin Sawyer had become a permanent fixture by this point, taking on a full role in the operation of the ranch, with a seriousness and competence that had only grown over the years. He had a gift for the horses that was evident, and a steadiness about the cattle work that Milton trusted completely. He was 21 now, and had the manner of someone older, careful and observant, with a dry sense of humor that showed itself only when he was comfortable. Francis was teaching at the school full-time by the winter of 1880, Mrs. Darby having stepped back from the classroom to manage the administrative side of things as the school grew. She was living in the spare room that Milton had built out, and she paid her board faithfully and ate supper with them most evenings, and was a presence in their lives that both of them had come to consider as natural and necessary as the seasons. She and Crispin Sawyer had arrived at some unspoken understanding that was evident to anyone watching them in the same room, though nothing had been said directly. Letitia watched this with the attention she gave to things that interested her and did not say anything to Francis yet, because Francis, like Letitia, needed to come to her own conclusions in her own time. Little Edmund, who everyone had immediately shortened to Ed without anyone deciding to, was a vigorous child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's wide shoulders already visible in embryonic form, and he had inherited from somewhere the quality of going full speed toward whatever interested him and stopping for nothing, which made him simultaneously delightful and exhausting. He had been walking since 11 months and talking since about the same time, and he had an opinion about everything that crossed his path, which he delivered without significant regard for whether it was solicited. He followed Milton through the barn and the pasture with the focused devotion of someone who has decided that this particular person is the most interesting thing in the world, and Milton, who had never spent time around small children and had not known what to expect, found that he loved this completely, loved the small determined footsteps behind him and the steady rain of questions that fell throughout any working day that Ed spent at his side. What is that? That is a fence post. Why? Because the cattle need to know where they are supposed to be. Do cattle not know where they are supposed to be? Not without the fence. A long pause for consideration. Do you know where you are supposed to be? Milton looked down at him, at the serious small face under the small hat that Francis had given him, and said, "Yes, right here." Ed appeared to find this satisfactory and moved on to his next question, which was about the horse. In the spring of 1881, Letitia told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same direct way she had told him the first time, in the evening after supper, and he had learned enough by now to receive this news without the kind of visible alarm that she found exhausting in other people. He took her hand and asked how she was feeling and what Clara had said, because she had already seen Clara, which he should have known she would have done. "Clara says July," Letitia said. "She says everything is as it should be." "Good," he said, and meant it fully. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps Letitia was better at managing it, or perhaps both, and the summer of 1881 was a good summer on the land, the rains generous and the cattle fat and the garden extraordinary by any standard. Frances had planted sunflowers along the south fence, which she said her father had always wanted to do but had never gotten to, and they came up thick and tall and turned their faces to the sun in the long July afternoons, and the whole south side of the property had a brightness to it that was good to see. The second baby came in the middle of July, and this time Milton did not pace the porch and the barn in the same unmoored way he had done the first time. He was in the house, in the kitchen, close enough to be there if needed, and he heard the baby's voice and knew from its pitch and character that this was a child who had come into the world with its own agenda, which it was apparently delighted about. Clara brought this one out to him, and the baby was pink and soft and had Letitia's chin already, unmistakably, a small but specific version of the same jaw. A girl this time. A daughter with her mother's chin, and it would become clear over the following months, her mother's dark eyes and her mother's particular attentiveness to the world around her, the habit of watching before speaking that would serve her as well as it served Letitia. They named her Ruth. It was a name that both of them had had in mind independently, and when Letitia said it, Milton had nodded immediately, and that had been that. Ruth and Edmund grew up together in the way of children close in age, which meant in constant negotiation punctuated by periods of total alliance. Edmund was louder and faster, and threw himself at the world with a complete lack of caution that made everyone who loved him somewhat weary. Ruth was quieter and more observant, and had a patience beyond her years, and the two of them together created a kind of balance that was as good for the homestead as it was for each other. Francis Grayson and Crispin Soto were married in the summer of 1882, in the same small church where Milton and Letitia had married, with the same Reverend Webb officiating, and many of the same community members present. Frances wore a dress the color of deep blue sky, and carried the kind of contained joy that was characteristic of her when she felt something deeply, and Crispin stood beside her with a steadiness that everyone who knew him recognized as the full expression of his character. Letitia stood up with Frances as she had promised she would when the time came, and Milton stood with Crispin, and afterward at the celebration that happened in the Sawyer yard because it was the largest gathering space anyone could offer. Letitia danced with her husband in the long summer evening light and thought about how the world could sometimes arrange itself better than you had planned for. "Your sister looks happy," Milton said. "She is," Letitia said. "She has been happy for some time, but she needed to be sure." "That runs in the family," he said, not unkindly. She tilted her head and looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "I have found it to be one of your better qualities." "Because it was worth waiting for," she suggested. He smiled at that, the real smile that he saved for things that genuinely pleased him. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly why." Crispin and Frances moved into a small house on the eastern edge of the Sawyer property that had been built for the purpose over the winter, Milton and Crispin having spent the colder months on its construction when the cattle required less active management. It was a modest house but solid, with 2 rooms and a good stove and a window on the east side that caught the morning light, and Frances planted herbs along the south wall in the spring, and organized her books along a shelf that Crispin made for her from good timber, and the house became exactly what it was meant to be. The Sawyer Ranch continued to grow through the years that followed, in the incremental and deliberate way of people who plan carefully and work consistently. Milton hired 2 additional hands in 1883 as the herd expanded, men named Augusto and Dell, who came well recommended, and who proved to be as good as their recommendations. The operation was now large enough to require genuine management, and Milton and Letitia sat down every month with the ledger and the accounts and worked through the numbers together, and every year they were in a better position than the year before, which was exactly what they had aimed for. The railroad had changed everything about the cattle business in the territory, as Milton had anticipated it would. Getting the herd to Springer was a day's drive rather than a week's, and the prices in Springer, with the railroad connection to Kansas City and the markets beyond, were better than anything the territory had offered before. They were not wealthy by the standards of the large Texas ranchers, but they were prosperous by the standards of the territory, and more importantly they were secure, which was what Letitia had been working toward since the day her father died. There were still injustices in the territory that people of good conscience were aware of, the struggles of the Mexican-American families, whose land grants had been contested by powerful interests since before New Mexico was even formally organized as a territory. The continuing disruptions and broken agreements that affected the Apache and Navajo and other peoples whose claims on this land went back further than anyone else's. These were not abstractions to the people of Colfax County, who lived alongside these realities daily. Milton had known men on both sides of these conflicts in his years working the territory, and he understood what was at stake in human terms, even where the outcomes were beyond his power to influence. Letitia had her father's commitment to fair dealing with everyone who came to the property, and she maintained it. And when Pico Lujan's family faced a challenge to their land grant in 1884, she provided a letter of character and support without being asked, because it was the right thing to do, and Edmund Grayson had raised her to understand that clearly. Ed Sawyer, by the age of 5, had developed the deep conviction that he would spend his life working horses, a conviction so firmly held that it was difficult to argue with. He had a gift for them that was obvious to anyone who watched him in the corral, a quiet ease and a patient communication that was more mature than his years, and that Crispin recognized and quietly encouraged. Crispin was the best horseman on the property, and he gave the boy serious attention and instruction, which Ed received with the total focus of someone who has found the thing he is meant to do. Ruth, who was 4 and moving quickly toward 5, had decided that she was going to learn to read as soon as possible, and had already made significant progress under Aunt Frances's enthusiastic instruction. She sat at the kitchen table with her primer with the same serious determination her mother brought to the account book, and she sounded out the letters with a precision that delighted everyone, and that she herself seemed to consider merely the appropriate approach to a task worth doing. On a warm September evening in 1884, 6 years after the night Milton had proposed on the kitchen floor in the middle of a rainstorm, Letitia was sitting on the porch in the late light, watching the shadows come long across the pasture. The cattle were moving slowly toward the water in the distance, and the mountains to the west were going purple and gold. And from inside the house she could hear the children, Ed's voice and Ruth's, the particular rhythm of their evening together. Milton came and sat beside her. He had been checking the south fence line, the same fence line he had been riding when the storm came up 6 years ago, and the thought had finally formed itself into action. He took off his hat and set it on his knee and looked out over the land. "Long day," she said. "Good long day," he said, which was the distinction that mattered. She was quiet for a moment, and he let the quiet be what it was, which was comfortable. This was one of the things she valued most about him, that he understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed keeping. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "About the cattle." "No," she paused. "About the day you proposed." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the mountains, at the particular quality of the light that came at this hour, and her profile was the same profile that had undone him from very early on. The strong line of jaw and the dark eyes and the way she held herself like someone who expected the world to be exactly as substantial as she was. "I have been thinking about what you said," she continued, "that you could not wait for better weather any longer. I remember saying that. I have thought about it many times. I think about it particularly on evenings like this one." She turned to look at him then, and the last of the evening light was in her eyes. "I am glad you did not wait." "So am I," he said. "I might have needed more time," she said, with the honesty she always brought to things. "I am not certain I would have gotten there first. I was still being cautious." "You were being thorough," he said. "There is a difference." She smiled at this because it was generous and also because it was accurate. "What made you decide that particular day?" He thought about this, about standing in the yard with the storm coming and the ring in his pocket, and the sudden clarity that all of his reasons for waiting were simply the same reason, which was that he was afraid of what it would mean if she said no. "I realized," he said, "that the right moment was not going to arrive from outside. I had been waiting for the world to provide it, and the world does not work that way. The moment was going to have to be made, and I was the one who had to make it." She was quiet, taking this in. "Also," he admitted, "you were right there, and I had been carrying that ring for 11 days, and I was losing my mind." She laughed, and the laugh was the same as the first one he had ever heard from her, quick and genuine and better than almost anything. "Well," she said, "I am glad it was the combination of the two." He took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch in the fading light, while the mountains went from gold to purple to the first deep blue of evening. And from inside the house, the voices of their children rose and fell in the particular music of children who are comfortable and safe, and have no understanding yet of how rare that is. The coming winter would be mild, as it turned out, and the spring after it would be one of the best they could remember. The water table high and the grass thick from the runoff, and the new calves healthy across the board. Crispin and Frances would have their first child in the spring, a boy they named Edmund after Letitia's father, because Frances had wanted to and Crispin had agreed without a second's hesitation. And Letitia had received this news with a feeling she could not quite name, but that was something in the neighborhood of completeness. Ed Sawyer, who was 5 and then 6 and then 7, grew steadily into the person he was going to be, which was a person deeply committed to horses and to the land, and to the particular kind of independence that came from understanding exactly how things worked and doing them well. He shadowed Crispin through the barn and the pasture, and was allowed to ride on his own for short distances by the time he was 6, because it was clear to everyone watching that the horse was not the dangerous element in this partnership. Ruth read everything she could get her hands on, which was not as much as she wanted in Cimarron, but was supplemented by Frances's steady supply of books from the catalog, and by the growing school library that Frances had built up from donations and purchases over the years. She had the quality of remembering everything she read with a completeness that sometimes startled people who underestimated her. In the summer of 1885, 7 years after the Rainstorm proposal and the garnet ring and the decision that could not wait for better weather, Milton and Letitia rode out to the eastern boundary of the property on a Sunday morning when Crispin was minding the cattle and the children were with Frances. It was a habit they had fallen into, this occasional Sunday morning ride, just the two of them, which was their version of taking the long view. They rode along the ridge above the Cimarron River, where the land fell away below them on one side and the mesa opened up on the other, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only existed at this elevation in this part of the world, a blue so clear it was almost painful. The horses moved easily side by side, Hector, who was older now and more dignified, and the bay mare that Letitia rode, who was called simply the Bay and who had been the best investment Milton had made in 4 years. "I want to tell you something," Milton said. She looked at him over the space between the horses. "Tell me." "I want to tell you that this is the life I would have chosen if someone had laid out every possible life in front of me and told me to pick." She was quiet for a moment, which was the way she received things that mattered. Then she said, "Even the hard parts. The hard parts are part of the choosing," he said. "You cannot pull them out and say you would keep the rest the same. It does not work that way." She considered this. "No," she agreed. "It does not. The winter we lost the 3 head. The year the market was bad. The months when money was tight." He named them the way you name things you have actually lived through, without drama. "I would choose all of it again. Because the other side of it is this." He gestured, and the gesture took in the land and the sky and her and everything that had accumulated over 7 years of working and building and being in this place together. Letitia looked out over the mesa. The shadows of a few clouds moved slowly across the ground below them, and the river made a bright line through the valley, and on the far ridge she could see the roof of the house her father had built and that she had kept, and that was now so fully a home in the deepest sense that the word did not feel adequate. "I have something to tell you too," she said. He waited. "There will be a 3rd child," she said, "in the winter. January, I think." Clara said January. The silence was the good kind. He reached across the space between the horses and found her hand, and she gave it to him, and they rode that way for a while along the ridge with the blue sky above them and the land spread out below, and the river glittering, and the world as it was, and as it was going to be. The 3rd child was another boy, born on a cold morning in the middle of January 1886 in the bedroom of the house on the Sawyer Ranch, with Clara Espinosa in attendance and Frances downstairs keeping Ed and Ruth occupied with something Frances called an educational project, and that Ed described afterward as extremely boring, though he had in fact enjoyed it. The baby was born healthy and loud, with his father's wide forehead and his mother's dark eyes, and a temperament that Clara said was the most opinionated she had seen in a newborn in recent memory, which was saying something. They named him James. After no one in particular, just a name they both liked, a plain, strong name that suited him from the first day. James Sawyer was a baby who knew what he wanted and communicated this without ambiguity, and who from the very beginning had a quality of absolute focus on whatever was in front of him that would, in time, make him formidable. As a baby, this was mostly focused on being fed and held, but the quality was there, the intensity, and Milton recognized it with a complicated mixture of pride and sympathy, because he could see what those years were going to be like. The winter of James's arrival was the mild one he had predicted, and the spring that followed was exceptional, and by the summer of 1886, the Sawyer Ranch was as solid and productive as it had ever been. The herd was at a size that required the full attention of Milton, Crispin, Augusto, and Dell, and there were conversations beginning about whether they should buy the section to the north that had come available when the previous holder moved on, which would extend the grazing range significantly. Letitia ran the numbers on the northern section with her usual thoroughness and came to Milton with her conclusion, which was that they could manage it if they were careful for the first 2 years, and if the cattle market held steady. Milton knew the land well enough to know that the northern section had good water access, which was the determining factor in this country. They bought it in August. It was the biggest financial commitment they had made since the original mortgage, and Letitia felt the weight of it in the way she always felt large decisions, with a seriousness that was not anxiety but was attention. And then she put it in the ledger and moved forward, because that was how you worked toward something. Edmund, who was 6.5 going on 40, had taken to riding out with Milton in the mornings on his small horse, a gray pony named Ghost, who had the pony's characteristic combination of stubbornness and sweetness in equal parts. Ed managed Ghost with a patience and authority that was genuinely impressive, and that Crispin observed and commented on with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose teaching had taken root. Ruth was in school full-time now with Aunt Frances, who taught her with the particular combination of high expectation and warm encouragement that good teachers deploy, and Ruth was among the strongest students in the class, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew her. She was also kind in the way that smart children are not always kind, generous with other students who struggled, which Letitia noticed and quietly thought was the best thing she had seen in her daughter. James, who was not yet in school but was already interested in everything that was happening in it, was managed largely through the combined efforts of the whole family and one extremely tolerant barn cat, who had decided that this particular child was its personal responsibility, and followed him everywhere with the resigned devotion of someone who has accepted a difficult assignment. On a Thursday evening in October of 1887, Letitia sat at the kitchen table after supper with the ledger open in front of her, and she went through the accounts with the thoroughness she had maintained since the day she took them over from her father. And when she reached the bottom of the column and added it up and compared it to where they had been a year ago, and 3 years ago, and 7 years ago, she sat for a long time with the figures in front of her. Milton came in from checking on the cattle and found her there, and he sat across the table from her and looked at her face, which had an expression he had learned to recognize over the years, the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been working toward for a long time. "Good news," he said. "Very good news," she said, and turned the ledger so he could see. He looked at the figures and then at her. The numbers told the story plainly. The land was productive, the herd was profitable, the mortgage was long since settled, the northern section was being absorbed smoothly into the operation, and the overall picture was one of genuine stability and health. "Your father would have been satisfied," he said, returning the words she had said years ago. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have been." She closed the ledger and set it aside with the particular finality of someone completing a chapter, and then she looked at him across the kitchen table, this kitchen where he had knelt on the floor with a ring in his hand and the rain coming down outside, this kitchen that had been the center of 9 years of life together. "I want to say something to you," she said. "Say it." "When you proposed," she said, "I told you yes because I was certain. But I want you to know that the yes was only the beginning of how certain I am. Every year makes it more true. Every difficulty we have worked through, and every good season, and every morning I have watched you with the children, and every evening like this one, it accumulates." She looked at him steadily with those dark eyes. "I love you more accurately than I did 9 years ago. I understand better what I am saying when I say it." The kitchen was warm. The lamp was burning. Outside, the October night was cool and clear, and through the window he could see the stars beginning to show above the ridge. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand and took his, and they sat that way in the kitchen that had been the center of so much, the kitchen where the rain had come down on the night. He finally stopped waiting for better weather and discovered that the weather had been fine all along. "I love you," he said, the same words he had said on his knee on that kitchen floor, simple and plain and meant entirely. She smiled at him, the real smile that she kept for things she genuinely felt. "I know," she said, "and I love you, and I am glad we are here." The years continued to unfold in the way of years that are well-lived, not without challenge but with the deep grain of the good running all the way through. Edmund grew into a young man who was already known, before he reached 12, as someone with a particular gift for horses that people came to see and to talk about. Crispin had given him everything he knew, and then told Milton that the boy had gone beyond what he could teach him and needed to find his own way with it, which was the highest thing Crispin knew how to say about someone's skill. Ruth, at 10 and 11 and 12, was reading things that made Frances look pleased and sometimes surprised, and she had begun writing her own accounts of things, little notebooks filled with her observations of the land and the people and the daily life of the ranch, which she kept private, but which Letitia had seen once by accident and thought were extraordinary. James remained the most determined and most focused person in the family, which in a family that included Letitia Sawyer and Edmund Sawyer was an accomplishment. He had attached himself to the cattle work with the same total commitment that Ed had brought to the horses, and by the time he was 5, he was underfoot in the pasture in a way that was simultaneously inconvenient and impossible not to encourage, because the dedication was genuine and the curiosity was good. In the summer of 1890, 12 years after a rainstorm had made a patient man impatient in the best possible way, the Sawyer family rode out together on a Sunday morning, all 5 of them, on the ridge above the Cimarron River. Ed on his horse, which was no longer Ghost but a good young quarter horse he had trained himself. Ruth on the bay mare. James on a steady roan that Crispin had selected for him with care. Letitia on a new horse, a dark chestnut mare she had bought the previous spring, and Milton on Hector, who was old now and gray around the muzzle and slower than he had been, but who was still sound and who moved along the familiar ridge trail with the dignity of a horse who knows exactly where he is. The land below them was the same land, the river and the valley and the long sweep of the mesa, but it was also different in the way that land you have worked for 12 years is different from land you first rode over, layered with history, with the particular weight of everything that has happened on it and because of it. Ed rode up beside his father and looked out over the range with the assessing eye of someone who is going to work this land someday and is already learning to read it. He was 11 years old and already taller than Letitia and moving quickly toward his father's height, and he had his mother's dark eyes and something else, something that was his own, a steadiness that seemed native rather than learned. "Will it always look like this?" he asked. Milton looked at his son and then out at the land. "The land looks like what you make of it," he said. "Your grandmother's people made this land look like a homestead. Your grandfather made it look like a ranch. What it looks like when you have it will depend on what you bring to it." Ed considered this with the thoroughness he brought to things that actually interested him. "I think I would keep the cattle," he said. "I hope so," Milton said. "I have put considerable effort into the cattle." Ruth came up on the other side and listened to this exchange with the attention she brought to conversations she thought were worth remembering. "What about you?" her father asked her. "I think I would keep the books," she said, which made Letitia, who was nearby, smile with a fullness that was partly pride and partly recognition. James, who was still young and unfiltered, pushed his roan up between all of them and said, "I would keep everything," which was so straightforwardly James that everyone laughed, and the sound of the family laughing carried out over the ridge and down toward the valley below. They rode back to the house in the late morning, through the gate that Edmund Grayson had built and that Milton had repaired twice over the years, past the kitchen garden where the late summer vegetables were going strong, past the barn where Hector had spent 12 years being a steady and reliable horse, and through the yard where, long ago, a man had stood in the rain trying to decide whether to walk to the kitchen door. Letitia dismounted in the yard and handed her horse to Ed, who took both horses with the casual competence that had become second nature, and she stood for a moment in the yard with the sun on her face and looked at the house. The house her father had built. The house she had kept and that had become something larger and richer than either of them had managed alone. Milton came and stood beside her, his hat in his hand. "Do you remember," she said, "standing out here in the rain?" "I remember." "You were afraid," she said. It was not an accusation, just the observation of someone who had been watching carefully. "I was," he confirmed. "You did not look it," she said. "I had been practicing looking like I was not afraid for most of my adult life," he said. "It is a skill that develops with repetition." She looked at him sideways, the way she did when she was deciding how far to take something. "You do not have to practice it with me," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. "That took some time to learn, but I know it." She took his hand in hers, the way she had taken it that night in the kitchen, and held it with the same certainty. The garnet ring was on her finger, the small dark fire that had been there for 12 years, a little worn now from work and weather, but still there, still exactly what it had been when he put it on her finger in a kitchen full of the sound of rain. The children were going in and out of the house and the barn, and from the smaller house to the east she could see smoke rising from Crispin and Francis's chimney, meaning Francis was already cooking something for the midday meal, which she would bring over in her characteristic way that made it clear it was a gift and not an obligation. The mountains to the west were clear and still, the way they were on a good day in late summer, holding the morning light with the patience of things that have been holding light for considerably longer than any of the humans looking at them. "This is a good life," Letitia said, not to him in particular. To the yard, to the house, to the mountains, to the river below, to the memory of her father and the love of her mother and the sister who had become her nearest neighbor and the 3 children who were the best things she had ever done. "Yes," Milton said. He was looking at her and the land in the same gaze, the way he had been looking at both for 12 years, because for him they were part of the same thing, this woman and this place that she had made and that he had come to. "It is the best one I can imagine." The morning went on in the way of mornings on a working ranch, full of the ordinary necessities that were themselves a kind of richness, and by midday the whole family was gathered around the table, which required the addition of the extra leaves and all available chairs, because Francis and Crispin and young Edmund Lujan were there as well, and the room was full of voices and the sound of food being passed, and the particular warm noise of people who belonged to each other. Letitia looked down the length of the table at her husband, and he was already looking at her, which was something she had noticed he did, held on to her with his attention the way some people held on to things they valued. She held his look across the table and the children and the food and the years, and she felt the whole weight of what they had built together, which was not a small thing and was not a simple thing, but was good all the way through. Outside, the autumn light was settling gold over the mesa. The cattle were moving in the far pasture, and the horses were in the corral, and the fence lines were sound, and the books were in order, and the land was theirs. Free and clear, all the way down to the bedrock. There would be more good seasons and some hard ones, because that was the nature of this country and of any life worth calling a life. There would be years when the cattle market slumped and years when the rain withheld itself and years when things went sideways in ways that could not be anticipated. But there would also be more evenings on the porch watching the mountains go gold, more Sunday morning rides along the ridge, more suppers that lasted past dark because no one was ready to let the evening end. There would be Ed growing into a man who worked horses the way great horsemen work them, as if the language was native to him. There would be Ruth, with her notebooks and her precision and her mother's eyes, going out into the world and making something extraordinary of herself. There would be James, focused and determined, eventually growing into the land the way his grandfather had grown into it, becoming part of it. There would be grandchildren eventually, small faces that carried all of them in some partial way, dark eyes from one side and wide shoulders from the other, the particular Grayson chin appearing across generations like a signature. But all of that was ahead, as it should be, the future unrolling itself in the proper direction, toward things that were not yet known and would be good. What was here, what was now, was this. The table full of people she loved. The man at the other end of it who had knelt on her kitchen floor in the middle of a rainstorm, with a ring in his hand because he could not wait for better weather any longer. The land her father had believed in enough to work, and that she had believed in enough to keep. The life built carefully and together, and with the kind of love that grows rather than diminishes, that accumulates rather than depletes. That looks at 12 years of morning and evening and difficulty and joy and says with complete honesty, I would choose this again, every single part of it. The rain had been the right weather after all. The rain had been exactly right.